In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
Something interesting happened in the religious world last week. If you were paying attention, I think it was last week that the Pope came out and said something interesting, and it's relevant to our study. Do you remember what he said? Does anybody in the room know what he said? Norris knows because he sent me the email, but I'd already heard about it. The Pope has said that evolution and the Big Bang probably are true, and they're scientific, and they do not violate any Christian scriptures, and it can be part of the scripture world. That's part of the Christian world. Well, we've talked about that here, and that's what a lot of Christians have. He needs to view my YouTubes. I don't know if he speaks enough English, but anyway, I thought that was interesting because he is now kind of acquiesced. He's kind of gone to the side that believes in theistic evolution, obviously. Now, I don't know the details of what he said. I don't know how much. Is he talking about molecules to man evolution? I assume he is. But if he's talking about evolution as far as change within kinds, then we're agreeing with him. And if he uses the Big Bang as more as a metaphor of in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and said let there be light, then I agree with him that. But I suppose that's not what he's saying. I suppose he's more leaning towards the theistic evolution and the Big Bang as we know it. He made an interesting comment if you saw any of the news clips, and that is that God doesn't wave a wand. Okay? I sort of get that a little bit because we've been talking about processes here. And so, no, God doesn't necessarily wave a wand, but God can create, and he can create by the spoken word, and that's what he did. So it's kind of facetious to say waving a wand. But when we're talking about the flood, for example, God could have used any number of ways to have saved Noah and his family. I mean, think about it. He could have done anything, couldn't he? He could have, sent some sort of a vehicle down here from heaven and placed them in it and all that. I mean, you can think of any number of ways that he could have saved those 8 souls without using an ark. But he chose an ark. So it wasn't waving a wand that saved mankind from the flood. It was God through his instruction to Noah, and therefore Noah had to obey what God said. But the ark was the vessel that saved man, right? And so that's what we're looking at. Was the ark able to do what the Bible said it was able to do? Was the story of the flood real? Because that is a process. God did not wave a wand. There was, I believe, some miraculous aspects of the flood, but most of it, I think, was naturally. He saved man and animals through a natural way, and that natural way was building an ark. Else, what was the purpose of the ark anyway? I mean, he could have saved them in a supernatural way if he wanted to. So I want to try to keep as much of the supernatural out of the story of the flood, because the flood was a real event, and it was, and I believe the ark was a real vessel. And so I want to keep that out of it as much as possible. But I thought it was interesting what the Pope said, because that's where a lot of us are. A lot of people that would consider themselves conservative Christians are leaning towards now. Theistic evolution, at least at some point, and also a naturalistic cause of the universe. Last week we got into the flood, and we mentioned that the flood was probably the second greatest geologic event that has ever occurred in the history of mankind, save for the creation itself, the creation event itself. Much more potent than any cataclysmic, catastrophic event mankind has ever witnessed before or since, certainly before, but even since. And any kind of cataclysmic event you can think of, Krakatoa eruption that was back in the 19th century, the Hurricane Katrina, all of these things, the volcanoes that we see going off in the world today and in the past, the great earthquake, the great tsunami, the Indonesian tsunami that killed probably at least 200,000 people. Those were horrible, cataclysmic, natural events, if you will, but not a single one of those compares to what happened with the worldwide flood that occurred during Noah's day, where there was 40 days and 40 nights of rain, the fountains of the deep opened up, and the world was flooded, and Noah was essentially in that ark for about a year. And by going into the ark, carrying all the animals, 2 of every animal except for the clean animals, where there was 7 of the clean animals, and then himself, his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives, that's what was saved in the ark. And we all know the story of the ark. We've looked at that before, so I'm not going to go into great detail. But the one question I do want to ask is, again, through naturalistic processes that God instituted, was the ark able to do what it was created to do? Does it make scientific sense that it could have saved all animals of the world? And so we want to look at that briefly, like I said, again. And so the first thing, though, is to disprove the notion that the biblical story is a myth. It's not written as a myth. It's written as a historical fact. The precision of the dates, the precision of the names, the precision of the geographic locations is not written like a myth. So I think we can dispel the notion that it was a myth. Some people say it wasn't a myth, but it was a local event, and I think we can dispel that. The Bible clearly talks about it being a worldwide event, and you got to impart a lot of figurative language in the book of Genesis, in those chapters of Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 that deal with the ark, to come up with the concept that it was a local event. Local event would be easy then. Well, he could have saved some animals locally, and the ark would have been big enough for local event. But was it big enough to do what it was intended to do if it was a worldwide event? How is it possible that one man could have built the ark? Could the technology of the day have produced a vessel that was seaworthy? And was this vessel big enough to contain all the animals the ark is described in Genesis? Once again, the earth was flooded by water, not just from the heavens, but from the fountains of the deep. And so there would have been enough water to do the job, and a worldwide flood would have been possible. We also keep in mind that the geography of the world at that time was probably quite a bit different than the geography of the world is today. Now, there was mountains and hills. That's implied when you look in the first few chapters of Genesis, but probably not the mountain ranges that we know, the Himalayas, the Rockies, and all that. And the earth may have even been just one big continent at that point in time. So it wouldn't have taken as much water, is the point. And again, keep in mind that Noah had upwards to 120 years to build the ark, and Noah, in all likelihood, didn't build the ark himself. He would have had help. He certainly could have had his 3 sons and his daughter-in-laws helping him build the ark, and his wife, but he could have even employed some of the local people there that were around to build the ark, even though they wouldn't have been heeding him. And most likely, the stories you always get of people making fun of Noah because, here he is building an ark. The Bible doesn't necessarily say that, but he certainly didn't convince anybody other than his own family to go on to it. And that's a graphic way of looking at the ark that Hodges has in his book, Creation and Evolution, and shows that basically the water was on the earth for about a year till Noah finally got off the ark. How about the tools that he had in hand? Were they adequate? Well, we don't know exactly what tools he had, but we know very shortly after the flood, if you go back and look at the archaeologic evidence, there was plenty of tools around then to build vessels that could have been as big as the ark. And so in all likelihood, Noah had those tools as well. And with enough time, the idea that he didn't have any tools at all, yes, he would have had tools to build it. And there would have been plenty of timber to build an ark. And recall how big the ark was. It's about 2/3, maybe 3/4 the size of the Titanic if you use the cubit as 18 inches. If you use the cubit as 24 inches, it would have been even bigger. But plenty of time to build it. Was it seaworthy? Was the ark seaworthy? Well, Mark Hartzmeyer, professor of mechanical engineering at Mississippi State University, has concluded the ark as described in the Old Testament could have withstood waves as high as 500 feet. And there have been other models that people have tested about the seaworthiness of the ark. We don't know exactly what it looked like. We got the dimensions. We got the one window and the one door. But as far as and we know it had 3 decks. But exactly, was it a box shape? Was it a boat like we know of a boat? Don't know that for sure. But it could have been constructed with the dimensions that are given, and it could have still been seaworthy. Even Korean researchers in 1992 tested the seaworthiness of multiple sized vessels and shaped vessels and concluded that the ark outperformed all of them except for the very smallest ones. But it would have still been sufficient. Now, how about big enough? Was it big enough to contain all the animals? Well, the estimated number of species in the world is as high as 3 million. So it would seem very incredible that the ark could have carried 3 million species. But it didn't have to. Species were not kinds. Kinds and species are different. The concept of kinds and species are different. It would have needed all the kinds of animals. So it wouldn't have needed all the felines. One cat would have been sufficient. 2, I guess, male and female. Same thing with the canines and so on and so forth. So it wouldn't have needed that many species. John Woodmarap has carried out the feasibility study of the ark, and he's concluded that at most it would have needed 16,000 animals total, 2 of each kind. And remember, the average size of the animal was probably about the size of a sheep or a dog. Now, there would have been bigger animals, but they wouldn't have to have been mature animals, would they? Even dinosaurs. Dinosaurs could have been small. They didn't have to have the biggest giraffe. They could have had a baby giraffe, that kind of thing, hippopotamus, so on and so forth. So most of the animals would have been about the size of a sheep or dog, average. Some would have been much smaller. Some would have been bigger, and they didn't have to all be mature. And so this is where I kind of didn't make it real clear on our last lesson, but the ark would have been enough room to have had 125,000 sheep. Where do we come up with that number? And I didn't do a good job telling you that, but the figure is calculated by 240 sheep could have been kept in a normal size railroad car, and if there was enough room in the ark for 522 railroad sized cars or livestock box cars, that would have carried 125,000 sheep. You didn't need 125,000. Woodmarap said 16,000. Now some conservatives or some Christians have said, well, maybe as many as 35,000 kinds, different kinds. But even if you use the upper limit of normal, 35,000 is still a whole lot less than 125,000. So there was plenty room. And that would have left quite a bit of room for storage of food and other things, water and other things that you would need. And so it should also be kept in mind that some of the animals created 1,600 years earlier may have become extinct by then. I don't know that for a fact. The Bible doesn't say, but that's possible. So some have questioned how all these animals could have been fed, and we mentioned that last week again. Again, the top number is 35,000, enough space for 125,000, so there would have been enough room for plants to feed these animals. But the Bible also uses the word nest when it talks about the rooms that were built, and these nests imply possibly that the animals could have been in some sort of hibernating state or asleep and wouldn't have required nearly as much food. Now, do animals hibernate? Well, of course they do, but do all animals hibernate? Well, no, they don't. So some would impart a miraculous thing here. Well, God could have made them hibernate. Well, now you're imparting the miraculous. It's okay with that, and it's possible God did that, but you don't have to do that. It could have happened had they hibernated or not. And some skeptics have doubted whether there was enough water on the earth. We've already mentioned that. There was enough water when you consider where the water was coming from. So where did the water go after the flood, and where is it now? It's in the ocean. Pretty simple. The oceans are deeper now than they were, and the water would have receded. Mountains would have come up from the continental drift that occurred, or the continental run, if you will, that would have occurred. And so that's where they're at. They're on the seafloor. Mountain ranges were created, Great Lakes were created, no doubt, and even continents were created. Dr. Henry Morris, in his book, The Genesis Records, has summarized how he believes the world has changed after the flood. We did this quickly, but again, I'm going to do it again so you understand what kind of things probably, or at least possibly, happened to the world after the flood. So after the flood, oceans became more extensive, much deeper, and land areas became more extensive, and more continents probably. There was most likely a significant temperature differential. And I think this is key, because before the flood, did it snow? We never read of snow before the flood. But after the flood, I think something happened in the atmosphere of the earth that caused a significant temperature differential. And it inaugurated a lot more weather than they had before the flood. Would have resulted in possibly even the ice ages that we have after the flood. I think the ice ages occurred after the flood. There's this canopy theory. This vapor firmament or canopy was removed that might have been there before. A lot of people believe that the canopy was there. I tend to believe that as well. What happened after this canopy was removed is now you have much more radiation being bombarded upon the earth. And that would have significantly decreased the life expectancy of animals and certainly of mankind. And this is basically verified in the book of Genesis, isn't it? How old was Noah when he started building the flood? The ark, excuse me. Before the flood started. When he started building the ark, before the flood. About 500 years old. He was like 600 when he got in the ark. So he was an old man. But we know people didn't live that long thereafter. As stated, mountain ranges would have been formed, glaciers formed, rivers formed, Great Lakes formed that we see today. We're going to see that in the second part of this lesson. The crust of the earth most likely became much more unstable after the flood, producing earthquakes and volcanoes, which we still have. And it's also possible that the Earth's rotation sped up by about 1.5%. I'm not sure the significance of that. That's just a statement that Dr. Henry Morris made. Dr. James Hodges, in his book, Creation versus Evolution, believes that the plate tectonics driven by runaway subduction of the pre-flood ocean floor is able to account for the unique pattern of large-scale tectonic change that is evident today and would fit in the biblical time frame. And we've talked about plate tectonics. That's responsible for our continents. Plate tectonic processes, which move very slowly today, probably operated much faster when the flood occurred. And the thermosphere, which now extends around the earth, is almost an empty shell, once contained much more gas and water vapor, going back to that canopy concept. And certainly, as I said, there were some miraculous elements of the flood, such as the gathering of the animals. I don't know how you could have gathered all those animals without something done miraculously. So I think there might have been something to that. The animals came to the flood, came to the ark, but that's not necessarily had to occur. But also, how about the shutting of the ark door? I guess, again, you could have devised some way to shut that door and seal it, but I think God did that. But I think the rest of the story is very real, very physical events produced by God. And certainly God could have chose any number of miraculous ways to save Noah, but he chose the ark. And I think for multiple reasons. So in doing so, the faith of Noah and his family was able to preserve all flesh, and in a figure, the Bible in the New Testament talks about this, in a figure, mankind are now saved through water as well, but not through an ark, but through obedience through baptism. And so lesson 8 is going to deal with what I call, and what has been called, historical and non-biblical evidences. So if you agree what we've said so far, then you agree that it's at least possible that the ark, and very probable that the ark could have carried out the work God intended it for to do. Correct? Everybody's agreed on that. So is there any evidence, though, that it actually occurred? That's not from the Bible. If you're trying to teach the skeptic about the ark and about the Bible, you can't go to the Bible to prove that the ark existed if they don't believe the Bible's the Word of God to begin with. Right? So these are evidences that I call non-biblical, historical evidences. And I mentioned this last time. If a worldwide catastrophic, cataclysmic event such as the flood occurred, which we certainly believe it did, and only 8 souls were saved, and then those 8 souls then, after they left the ark, went out and multiplied, and the rest of the world that we have today is a result of those 8 souls. Is it reasonable to think that there would be some non-biblical evidences for a worldwide flood? Is that at least reasonable to think? It is. I mean, to me it is. You know, the Hebrews, through Moses, wrote the story through the Holy Spirit of the flood. But the flood was a physical event. You would not have needed the flood to you would not have needed the Holy Spirit or the Bible to tell you about a flood if it occurred, because other men could have written about it too, down through the ages. You know, just like Jesus Christ. The Bible tells us Jesus Christ existed, but we have non-biblical evidence that he existed too. And we're going to talk about that in our class later on this spring. So there's other non-biblical evidence, and you certainly don't need that. It's okay just to believe what the Bible says, and I'm fine with that. That's what I believe too. That's how I was brought up. But if I'm trying to teach the non-believer, I'm going to go to some non-biblical or historical evidences. Now, these evidences don't prove anything, but they sure lend evidence. It's kind of like in a jury trial. You give all the evidence you can give, and then you try to decide by the preponderance of evidence which one is more likely. Was there a flood or was there not? And when you get through with the historical, non-biblical evidences and the geologic evidences, I think the preponderance of evidence is there had to be a worldwide flood. So we're going to look at those just real briefly. And some of the evidence comes from historical findings. So an interesting thing is that almost every culture in the world has a flood story. I mean, from the Aborigines in Australia to the South Americans, to the North American population, to the European, certainly from the Asian in the Middle East area, they all have flood stories to some extent. Would that not give some sort of credence to the fact that there probably was a worldwide flood? Now, most of these flood stories are worldwide floods, and almost all of them mankind is saved. There are some that have remarkable similarity to the biblical account. The oldest one on record comes from the Sumerians of southern Mesopotamia. And this gives you, you know where Mesopotamia is. I guess you could refer to it as the Fertile Crescent, the Tigris, Euphrates. We know that Abraham came from where? Ur, the Chaldees. That would be in the Mesopotamia area. And so the Sumerians were from this area. And this story is dated 2500 BC. Would that have been before or after Moses wrote the story of the flood in Genesis? It would have been before. So this story predates the biblical account. Estimated about 800 years. Predates it. And so it's the oldest known copy of a flood legend and was found at Nippur in southern Mesopotamia from the Sumerian culture. In it, the goddess Ishtar decided to destroy the world by flood. But on discovery of her intent, Zuzudra was able to ride out the flood in a huge boat, after which he offers sacrifices to the sun god. That's the ancient Sumerian legend, flood legend. And this is the goddess Ishtar on the left, and on the right depicts Zuzudra, who was mortal, who was human, and he saved the world by riding it out in this big flood. Not a lot of detail in this flood story. Not a lot of detail in this flood story. The most well-known flood story, non-biblical, is the Gilgamesh epic. Have you heard of the Gilgamesh epic? Some of you have. This comes from more or less the Babylonian area, the Babylonians. And it was discovered quite a long time ago, in 1872. You know, that was well over, 150 years, 140 years, something, by British Orientalist George Smith. And it was found in that area of Babylon or Mesopotamia. And he brought these clay tablets back. Some 20,000 clay tablets are fragments of such tablets. And on there is inscribed in cuneiform inscriptions, cuneiform kind of like how the Egyptians wrote, in cuneiform inscriptions. And by deciphering these cuneiform inscriptions, you see a remarkable story of a flood, and a flood account that has similarities between the biblical account that some have called truly amazing. And we'll look at those similarities in just a moment. But there is a few of the fragments of these clay tablets that are now housed, I believe, in the British Museum, National Museum of Britain. I'm sure they don't have all 20,000 there, but I mean, they've got some on display, and that's what they have. And again, most of you heard of Gilgamesh. So Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk. Uruk, those names are similar in Mesopotamia area. In fact, you have several Urs. Well, he was the king of Uruk. And he tells Pishatim, I can't say that name very well, but I'll do the best I can. Apishtim, I'm going to call it, to build a large boat to escape a massive flood to be perpetrated on mankind by the angry gods. Gilgamesh was told this by the gods. And what were the gods angry about? They were angry about the noise that mankind was making. It was keeping them from their sleep. And so he's been told. Gilgamesh tells Anapishtim to build this boat. And the boat was to have 7 decks. So this is not, all this is different than the biblical account. But what is similar to the biblical account is the detail. There's a detail of what was to be built. So the detail's different, but there's detail. Supposed to have 7 decks, 120 cubits on each side, and was to be filled with all living things. That's similar to the biblical account, isn't it? Now, the flood was much shorter than the Gilgamesh epic. It was 6 days and nights, and it turned all mankind that was outside the boat into clay. What's peculiar about a lot of these accounts is, in all these accounts that give any detail to them, the ships come to rest on some sort of mountain. And is that not what happened in the biblical account? Mount Ararat. In this case, the mount was Nisir. And Unapishtim sent forth a dove, a raven, and swallow. Does that sound familiar? Swallow's different, but the dove and the raven's the same. So, in the Gilgamesh epic, the dimensions of the ship are given, though of course they differ. The earth was full of violence, in this case, a lot of noise, stirring up the gods. And in both cases, you have representatives of all animals are taken into the ark. Other similarities include the sending of the raven and the dove, afterwards thanksgiving being offered after the flood, and sacrifices offered. Of course, in the Gilgamesh epic, he's offering it to the gods. In Noah epic, he's offering it to the true one God. You also have, and again, we could go through every culture. We would spend weeks going through every culture, so obviously that's not our intent. But it's to show that this is a common theme. The Chinese have a story that's dated 1,000 years BC. It speaks of the flood covering the mountain with the character Nuah, saving himself, not Noah, but Nuah, saving himself and other, quote, righteous people by building a large boat. 8 people, 4 pairs, and a pair of son of animals, and 7 of others are saved and come to repopulate the earth after the boat comes to rest on a mountainside. Now that has very similar detail, doesn't it? How about the Hindus? Hindus in the Rig Veda. You know what the Rig Veda is? That's the writings of the Hindu. They're kind of their Bible, if you will. They have the story of the flood, which was recorded in the 9th century BC. It speaks of a hero Manu, who was warned by a god of an impending flood and builds a ship to house seeds, male and female animals of that says very, it should be every species, and of course people. And again, in this case, it's 8. And that's kind of a Chinese depiction of the boat. Obviously, it had to be much bigger than that, but that's just a little pictogram or picture of it. After emerging from the ship, once again coming to rest on a mountain, in this case, the Himalayas, the people repopulate the earth and a new race of mankind occurs. So, skeptics have used these flood legends as evidence that the Noah flood or the Noachian flood was simply another myth. But the commonality among the ancient legends about a world flood, I think, is at least very impressive, that there probably was a worldwide flood, if every culture has these stories in them. Ray Winkle, who wrote The Flood, this is how he summarizes it. He says, "No fair and open-minded person can, in the face of this accumulation of flood traditions, which are found with so many people, persist in relegating the biblical story of the worldwide flood to the realm of meaningless fable." There's just too much commonality. And most of these myths that you read about or hear about are at least based upon some sort of physical reality. Again, from Ray Winkle. If there was not such a world catastrophe of which all the flood traditions bear witness, how can they be accounted for? And again, nature myths have their origin in a great historical fact. We cannot escape the conclusion that these flood traditions are an indisputable proof that the world catastrophe as described in Genesis is one of the greatest facts of all history. It has left an indelible impression on the memory of the entire human race. Of course there's a difference, and we know that, of course. There's a clear difference between these myths and these epics and these tales from what the biblical account is. And of course, one of the biggest things is that the biblical account is not written as a myth. It's not talking about the multiple gods and all the other things that we see, but it is a real account with real days, with real geographic locations. And it is much superior to any of those other writings, those other tales. And it is certainly superior in its theologic, moral, and philosophical conception. Much more superior. It is a different story. Much more likely to have been inspired by the Word of God than these others for various reasons, but it is a much superior story. And think about it. And I think Hodges, in his book Creation and Evolution, brings out a great point, which we're going to read here in a minute. But just think about it. Noah was wandering around in the wilderness. I don't know exactly when he wrote the book of Genesis and the Pentateuch, but it had to be while he was in the wilderness, because he never made it to the land of Canaan. I guess he wrote it while he was there. So these were nomadic tribes at the time that this book was written. Inspired by God, I grant you, but nomadic tribes. Where would Noah have come up with this story and the detail that he had? So Hodges says, the relatively uncivilized nomadic Hebrews could not be expected to have arrived at this from their own wise revision of the accounts received secondhand from centers of civilization in Mesopotamia. And I agree with this next statement. Without revelation, the account of Genesis would be expected to be a poor second to the Gilgamesh epic. And it's superior to the Gilgamesh. That's just from a logical standpoint, it wouldn't make sense that Noah could have made this story up. And the detail that he made it up, it was the inspired word of God. So Ray Winkle in his book brings out a few other interesting similarities between the ancient cultures and the biblical account. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is, again, I would call what I've mentioned so far is pretty good proof that there's a worldwide flood. I think. Pretty good proof that there was at least a worldwide flood. Whether you believe in the Genesis account or not, there's pretty good proof that there was a worldwide flood. What I'm going to talk about now, as I would call a little bit softer evidence, but interesting, and I wanted to bring it up anyway, okay? But I'd say a little bit softer. And one is the generations before the flood occurred. And I didn't do the math on all this, and I certainly don't know the generations of the Chinese, Egyptian, Babylonian, or Indian accounts. But apparently there are 10 patriarchs in the antediluvian genealogy of Genesis. 10 patriarchs, generations, I guess you could say. And with a strange, persistent, this number reappears in the legends of a great number of nations, especially among those whose history dates back to the very beginning of human race, the Egyptians, Babylonians, Chinese, and Indians. In other words, the time frame. Now, remember what we said, how much time had existed on the earth prior to the flood? 1,600 years, probably. That's been estimated at the genealogies. If you look at the time frame with the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Chinese, and the Hindus, it looks to be roughly about the same. So is that just a mere coincidence, or could there be some validity to that in their stories? Now, this one is even softer, I would say. But I still thought it was interesting, so I wanted to bring it up. And so Ray Winkle also alludes to the idea that most people, though widely separated geographically in ancient and modern times, point to a season of the year in which a fearful cataclysm destroyed the human race. And this time of year is almost universal in when it's celebrated. And it's celebrated, or I don't know if you want to use the word celebrated, but when it's looked at or when it's observed. And that's probably a better word. And this season is the festival of the new year, not our calendar new year, but the new year of some of these other ancient civilizations. But the time frame is the same. And it's the time observed at the disappearance of the Pleiades, astronomical occurrence in the sky, at the end of October and the beginning of November. That's right now. What are we observing right now in this country? Halloween. Okay. So every culture has a similar thing when it comes to Halloween, looking at the dead, looking at something that occurred years ago. Again, I told you this was soft evidence, okay? But that's at least peculiar that they would all pretty much observe these all over the world. This is not just the United States, this is all over the world. All cultures, separated geographically, separated time-wise. This has been going on for many, 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 many years, and it just seems to be coincidental. And I don't know how they figured out exactly when the flood started, but it's surmised that it started and ended at about this time, because it was a year long. Started and he got off the boat about a year later. And that was supposedly at least the time. We're going to get into this because I want to finish this up next time we meet, and if I don't start it tonight, I may not have time to finish it then, and then we go into the radiometric dating. But again, archaeologic evidence. Historical, you understand the difference. Historical is the written word. Archaeologic is things that you find, hard substance. And has mankind tried to find archaeologic evidence. There have been expeditions after expeditions after expeditions to the Ararat area. for hundreds of years, and some of them very, very recently, looking for what? The ark. Now, is it likely that they would find it? Not likely. If it was 4,000, 5,000 years ago, very unlikely. But nonetheless, there are some archaeologic evidences, and again, some of these you might consider soft evidences, but interesting nonetheless. Some have claimed to find the ark, by the way, have found in years past, or at least evidence that there was a flood in the Mesopotamian area. The first one was in 1929 by Sir Leonard Woolley, a British guy, and he found an area and he found evidence of deposits, and he said, this shows that there was a flood. And then Vladimir Rostivsky, he's a Russian Christian convert, believe it or not, and he absolutely believes he found the ark. And he wrote a large account of it that you can read about. In Ray Winkle's book, he goes in great detail about this. The problem is none of that's been confirmed. There's no hard, fast evidence. In Woolley's case, the deposits that he found and then later found by Stephen Langdon were probably examples of only a local flood, could not be used to prove a worldwide flood. And in Roskinski's account, it might have been just a fable. We don't know. But never had any hard, fast evidence that he found the flood. But people continue to look. And we have, conservative Christians, the Morrises, Henry and John Morris have gone over there in the past looking for it. And others have gone looking for the ark. So far they haven't found it, and it's very unlikely they will. Several cultures in the past, such as the Armenians, the Menyas, and the Manu Assyria, have claimed to have relics of the ark, and the Armenians of today continue to claim to have some relics, pieces of wood that they say came from the ark. I think that's highly unlikely, but they claim to have. Now, what may be more likely? If you go back and look historically, Ray Winkle talks to the apologist Theophilus of Antioch, who referred to the remains of the ark, that they could see them in the mountains. That's possible, but right now that's strictly conjecture. So there have been a few modern expeditions carried out, some even since 1994, but in 1994 when Dr. John Morris was still alive, and John Morris is a persistent, informed ark enthusiast. His son Henry Morris has been over there since then as well, and he concluded in 1994 that nothing verifiable could show evidence of the location of the ark or the ark itself. And people have said they found pictures of it, and this is one that claims to be the ark, and I'm not going to go into detail to that, but nobody, I believe, really believes that was the ark. But have you seen any of these pictures in the past? Yeah, probably not true. In 2001, now this is interesting, the Turkish government, in conjunction with Ataturk University, they did biotonical studies. They weren't looking at evidence of the ark or finding the ark itself, but it would have made sense that if all these animals and all the food supplies that were in the ark came out, then that area should have showed evidence that would have come from the ark. So they looked at this botanical studies. They looked at crops such as wheat and barley and certain domesticated cattle that had come from the Ararat region, and that seemed to make sense that these could have came from the ark. Now this is also an interesting finding, but again, soft, admittedly, but at least interesting. Names of many cities in the Ararat area, the Ararat Mountains, are named after the tradition of Noah. And I don't know how to pronounce most of these names, but Nekhchevan is the place of descent, which is supposedly the mound of Noah's tomb. Morand, mother is there, supposed the tomb of Noah's wife. Terminen, the eight. Ekmyadazan, those who descended. And Kargasmaz, the raven won't land. These are some of the places that are still named over there in that region. And of course, though they're not proof of an ark, they at least provide evidence that there is an association between Noah and the Ararat region, and that a flood was part of the local tradition, at least in those areas in times gone by. And I believe this is a good place to stop. Oh, one more thing. What does all this historical archaeologic evidence mean? I don't know. I think it at least means there is some soft evidence that there's a world flood. We don't need that, but some people seem to need that, and there's evidence historically and archaeologically.